Hi, welcome to Cure America. I'm Jonathan Alexander. I'm sitting in today for Donald Eason, the president of Cure. An incredible time in our country, so many opportunities, so many promises that we've been given throughout the election cycle that we're seeing come to pass, but some challenges as well. There's a debt ceiling discussion. There's money that we have to claw back in terms of making government more efficient. There's a number of moral issues at play as well. Abortion, Planned Parenthood, where this country will go ultimately with some of the ethical considerations that Congress has to deal with that reflect the culture around America and also our international footprint. So much discussion that we can go through and that we will go through in the next hour. So we're happy that you're joining us again. With us are some very familiar faces. I'll just introduce Phil Kerpen, who's the president of American Commitment. Phil, thanks for joining us again and coming back. Certainly, and you all know Marty Dannenfelser. He's the vice president here at Cure for governmental relations and for coalitions. Marty, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Jonathan.
And Chris Ullman, the president of Eagle Forum. Chris, you know her, very familiar in the seat with us all the time, but just recently is coming back from a trip overseas in England. Well, I don't know if you have jet lag. It's probably been a few days, but welcome back to the seat. And
it's great to be back.
Certainly. Why don't you tell us a bit about American conservatism in England? You know, why are Americans headed over to sort of the counterpart or the response to Davos over in the UK? Talk about the conference that you attended there and the folks that were there.
Well, it's called ARC, the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship, and there were actually 4,000 people from around the world.
Wow.
1,000 Americans, 1,000 from the UK, 1,000 from Europe, outside of the UK, and then 1,000 from Asia and Africa combined. And we're all there as kind of an alternative to the Davos crowd, the World Economic Forum that wants to tell everybody what to do. And really, it's how do we preserve the best of Western civilization? What does it mean to be a responsible citizen? And so some of the issues that were discussed was energy policy. Now, England is really suffering under their net zero policies. Boy, are they hurting. So the United States is in a much better position. We were able to educate them on some of our best practices. When it comes to the issue of genital mutilation and transgender, the UK's gone farther than we have. They have turned back. They've turned away from that. They don't understand why it's still such a big issue in this country. Why haven't we woken up? So we talked about that. And another big issue that we talked about is the need for marriage, strong marriage, and more children born in strong marriages. And so that was one of our top issues. So that was very encouraging to see that the whole world is realizing we have a problem with birth rates falling and marriage rates falling, because that's how we really promote good citizenship and strong culture. Certainly,
and it seems that with a conference of that magnitude, 4,000 people attending, there's sort of a pulse or a tenor or a culture, and a lot of that is we're downstream of which we sort of lose focus. I think in a positive way, we lose focus of how much what goes around the rest of the world kind of impacts what happens here in a negative sense. Europe at times, really pushing some of these transgender ideas through the UN and through some of these globalist organizations onto the United States, and us sometimes having to be a stopgap against this neo-colonialism and returning back at least our country and hopefully influencing the rest of the world for Judeo-Christian principles. There's a lot there. I want you to just weigh in quickly, Marty, on some of the energy stuff. So in the past decade or so, we've seen Europe in their interactions with Russia kind of make some missteps when it comes to energy. What role does the United States play in sort of being an energy superpower once again and learning from the mistakes that Europe has made in terms of how to interact with Russia and some of these other global powers that have a lot of our oil but don't necessarily believe the same way we do?
Well, I recall that back during his first administration, President Trump tried to warn Germany in particular about becoming so dependent on Russia with that pipeline and so on. And they found out that was a big mistake, I think. Yeah, you have to look at innovation. Innovation is the way. Even if you accept the premise that global warming is a long-term problem and that sort of thing, you need to deal with it through innovation. By just crippling those sources of energy when you don't really have realistic alternatives is just foolhardy. And to become dependent on countries that you can't depend on that are hostile regimes is really another mistake. I was actually at the Department of Energy in the first Trump administration, and we were doing lots of LNG, liquefied natural gas exports, to countries in Europe, Poland and some other countries in Europe. Ukraine, I believe, was part of that as well. So it's much better for them and for us if they're dependent on us, because we're a dependable partner, and then our geopolitical interests are aligned when we're doing that. So I think we're seeing President Trump trying to do that now, trying to forge some economic relationships, particularly in the area of energy. And I think that could be good for Europe, and it could be good for the United States at the same time.
Certainly some progress there that we're seeing, but harping back on what they've done in the first administration, some of that coming to fruition. Phil, weigh in a bit on the international global front, as it were. We saw some recent attacks that went against terrorists, the Houthis, that have been stopping the Suez Canal and really causing the prices of goods to increase because of how they're attacking American warships and other goods and such. There was kind of a dust-up on signal where those war plans were revealed. But still, we saw out of the administration not running from the issue, but saying, hey, in principle, we were doing the right thing in stopping terrorists that have really harmed American goods and services. Talk about the posture of the Trump administration internationally. You can weigh on some of the economic stuff, but where does the U.S. stand in terms of our leadership internationally?
Well, I think that the U.S. is back as a strong leader after years of really being a follower and sort of just falling in line behind, the United Nations and the World Economic Forum as sort of a lead opinion. Trump is saying, no, we're going to stand for American principles and America first, and we're going to engage in the world, but from a position of United States leadership. And that has implications on all of these issues. One of the first things he did was lift that pause on natural gas exports that Biden had in. And I think even before Trump took office, Europe said, hey, maybe we'll buy from the U.S. instead of from Russia. So that was a pretty immediate impact even before he became president. And of course, in the strikes against terrorists in Yemen, it's a huge change in policy where we're now being proactive, where we're actually going to defend U.S. shipping interests. And, you can talk about the messages behind it, and that's kind of interesting in an inside baseball kind of setting. But the much bigger thing is that we did it, that we did the strikes, that we took out the terrorists. And I also think, the big negative and the big headline risk and the downside that markets have gone nuts about are the tariffs and the tariff threats that the president has put in. But even there, first of all, they're very small economically relative to the size of the overall economy. So that's overstated, especially when he's pursuing so much deregulation, tax cuts, and other things. But I also think we may actually see more free trade at the end of this exercise than we had before. And I'm particularly encouraged that it looks like India actually wants to do a free trade agreement and is lowering their tariffs in response to the president's reciprocal tariff threat. And we may have a big free trade agreement with India, which would not only be a huge economic win for both countries, but would isolate China, would have a huge benefit geostrategically as well. So I think that we're now seeing a shift from the U.S. being a go-along to get-along country that sort of defers to international elites, which is what we had under Biden, to exercising effective leadership in American interests.
I think that's a good point. On China particularly, we see this sort of as an economic soft war going back and forth. But we do have a partner in India that sort of has the same workforce contribution that China once filled in that gap. India can come in, and if we have that free trade agreement, I think we will see more prosperity between the two countries, not to mention, because of some of these tariffs or because of the strong arming, the amount of companies that are coming back to the United States. I think something like 4.1 trillion or so in investments, record number of investments from car manufacturers and other entities that are saying, hey, we'll move back to the United States and do our manufacturing there, which is great and excellent for jobs, but also for the economic prosperity of this nation. Chris, you mentioned some of these moral issues, and I do want to dive into there as well, particularly on the transgender issue. I know England, Netherlands, as you mentioned, they were sort of the front runners in pushing transgender surgeries on minors, but they've walked back their policies. Certainly Trump's executive orders in some of these states, plurality of states now, or at least 24 states, have stopped this altogether, are criminalizing the doctors that are doing this to children. What is your sense in American culture? Are we turning the corner on this particular moral issue, so-called gender affirming? And can we be a leader once again, saying no? We can encourage counseling. We can help these kids overcome, these unwanted confusions. Are we turning the corner? And did you see some of that in your conference?
Definitely think we are turning the corner in the United States. As a people, as a society, people are realizing that men don't belong in women's sports, they don't belong in women's bathrooms, in women's prisons, that minors, children, shouldn't be getting these surgeries. And those are things that at least the UK has already acknowledged. And I think the big difference in the United States, and something that we would need to work on, is that in the UK, both the right and the left realize that this is harmful to children. In the United States, the left will not give an inch on this. I was watching a video this morning of a Democrat state senator in Maine who voted to protect women's sports and bathrooms, and his constituents were screaming at him, how dare he betray them?
Wow.
And he said, I'm listening to the women of this district.
Yep.
And you might think you're the majority, but you're not. So it's how do we get the Democrats to realize it's not a partisan issue. The American people are 80% for protecting women. They're on the wrong side.
Yep.
And the UK is,
Absolutely right.
I mean, they have all kinds of people on the left who say, this is craziness. Why are we discussing this?
Just move on from
There
the
are men,
subject.
there are women, they're different. Come on.
and
So that's where we need to, and that's where the Democrats really need to open their eyes and listen to their constituents.
I think you're absolutely right. Seth Moulton, the Democrat congressman out of Massachusetts, he got flack for it. Even Governor Newsom, I don't really believe a word he says, but sort of posturing for the cameras. Marty, are the Democrats listening? You saw Schumer sort of cave on the continuing resolution, realizing that this hammering at Trump and hammering at this mandate is giving them the lowest approval numbers probably in their history. Are the Democrats going to listen and turn around on some of these issues that have an 80% unity across most Americans?
I think some of them would like to. I think that it's very tough because their base is very active, the hardcore of their base, and they just rise up when they see any kind of retreat. You're seeing Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez out there on the stump, and she's attacking the Democrats for backing down on these fights. But I think that there are some subtle ways, like what Schumer did, that he can just say, well, this isn't the right place to fight, and so on. So I think you will see a little bit of that, but it's just going to be very hard for them. But I think to Chris's point, this whole thing with Europe, CURE, my organization, did a policy report on this about the trans youth phenomenon, and we pointed out that England and several other European countries have been way out in the forefront on this over the last 15 or 20 years, and they are pulling back and they're putting more serious constraints on it. But I think there was just a lot of pressure here in the United States during the Biden administration. All the money, all the pressure on the doctors and the medical organizations were all pushing in this direction, and this had to become the science. I think the science gets corrupted, frankly. But at the very least, we should be able to say that children should not be exposed to this. If you decide you want to do this as an adult, that's a different decision, but at least we should protect children from making a decision that will have lifetime ramifications.
Certainly, I think you're right. We're coming to the end of this segment. We'll start off with Phil in the next segment, just talking about the tax and financial implications of some of these critical moral decisions. Marriage, children in the family. What are the tax implications in the conversations we're having now in reconciliation about how we use the power of the purse and taxing? We'll be back right at the other end of these messages.
Somebody comes to us when they are the most vulnerable. We have an obligation to our patients to tell the truth as we learned it and to not politicize it. We are performing surgeries on these children, and the only people benefiting is the medical industrial complex, because the more surgeries that are done, the more money it is made.
Whether you're talking about an 8-year-old or an 11-year-old or a 14-year-old, I don't see how you can actually derive informed consent.
We all know that we can't be getting true informed consent.
Our medical industry has objectively been compromised in more ways than one.
You become familiar with the sound a mother makes when you tell her that her child is dead.
And we're back here on Cure America. We're having sort of a robust discussion, not just about American policy, but American leadership across the world, but also some of the implications back home when it comes to how we use the power of the purse, our taxation and our spending. There are some moral issues, I think, just generally of are we going to be fiscally responsible? Are we going to continue to build up debt? Or are we going to start making wiser decisions in terms of how we use our funding? Phil, I want to come to you. Some of the decisions that we make for our budget is downstream of our ethics and our morals. Can you talk a bit about this season of reconciliation and continuing resolutions and budget? What should we anticipate in terms of good fiscal responsibility, in terms of our tax schemes, in terms of appropriations, and what we're putting forward as saying this is what Americans are going to be paying for or using our money towards in the next decade or so? Can you talk a bit about the tax schemes?
Yeah, well, in my view, the $2 trillion annual deficits that we're running are fiscal child abuse, because our children and our grandchildren will be burdened by that debt. They will have to pay that. They will have to pay it back, or they'll have to perpetually refinance it and pay the interest on it forever. Either way, the potential of the U.S. economy and therefore their standards of living will be held back dramatically if we don't change course.
Just pull out that number again. 2.1 trillion deficit year over year. Is that what we're running?
We're running about $2 trillion a year is what we've been running the last couple of years, which is insane.
Yeah.
I mean,
we've
never run deficits anywhere near that size, and so.
But Americans think that we're making so much money. We're gross domestic product and all that. But why isn't that translating in how we're budgeting?
We've been running sort of chronic deficits for a long time, but they really exploded dramatically in size when we increased spending for all of the COVID relief that was done, and the CARES Act under Trump. And then, of course, even though COVID was basically over, when Biden came in, they did American Recovery Plan and then Inflation Reduction Act, and they just piled these huge additional spending bills on top of the normal annual spending. And just like has happened historically, where you have wars and spending rises up and then it doesn't quite come back down, same thing happened with this. So we had this huge increase of temporary spending, but it wasn't really temporary, because we came down a little bit after, but nowhere near the trajectory where we were before. And so we now have massively higher spending as a consequence. And I'll give you just one example that's been a huge controversy in the news lately is Medicaid spending. Well, Medicaid spending is up 50% in the last 5 years. I mean, it's gone up almost vertical. And you've got California has almost doubled in the past 5 years, federal funding going into Medicaid in California. And by the way, they illegally use federal funding for illegal immigrants in California, even though they're not supposed to. They have a scheme for that, and that's a whole other issue. But the Republican budget said, okay, this has increased by 50% in the last few years. Instead of increasing 5% a year going forward from there, what if we only made it 3%? So it actually still increases every year under the Republican budget, just a little bit slower. And the Democrats say, oh my God, savage cuts. The media said they're going to throw everyone off Medicaid. And you look at the thing, it's like, but they don't even dial back any of the huge increase we just had. They just slow down a little bit the increase going forward. And so we've got a really sort of twisted budget situation where spending went up dramatically. And that's not the only program where it happened, although it's probably the biggest one. Spending went up dramatically, and now there's no will to cut it back at all. And even if you try to trim the increase, even if you try to slow the increase, they go crazy. They go nuts. They go wild about these cuts that don't exist. I mean, Medicaid goes up every single year under the House Republican budget, and yet you would act like, if you read the headlines, you would think that it's like some massive, savage cut. And so we've got just this huge pro-spending bias, which is why we're running these huge deficits. And it's extremely irresponsible for the simple reason that burdens future generations, either with slower economic growth or with higher interest burden, or at some point with a Greece-style crisis where you can't raise the money to pay for it, and you have an actual acute financial crisis as a consequence of that. So
Chris,
they've got to get spending under control.
Chime in a bit. Is that reflecting around the kitchen table? Like, are American families realizing that we're spending year over year massive amounts of deficits, that we're raising our spending to a place that is really unsustainable? I like what Phil said. It's child abuse. We're just passing this off to the next generation. Is that resonating with folks? And are we complicit? Is sort of this uniparty, spend and pay it off later, this uniparty principle? Are we complicit in us doing that?
I think we all are complicit, and I don't think we realize enough the implications. And there's another very big implication here, and that is, do we want a policy where our government's goal is to get more and more people on public assistance, or is the goal, which I think is part of the Trump vision, is to get people off government assistance? So not throw them off, but increase the economy so they can get jobs, take care of their families, be self-sufficient, and then that slowing the growth. Why are we slowing the growth?
Yep.
Because more people are economically independent of the government, and that's what we should want for all Americans. We shouldn't just say expand it and put everybody on public assistance. That's a morale killer, that's a spiritual killer, and so this president's overall vision through economic policy, energy policy, and everything is to make Americans self-sufficient. And I think that's a great goal.
I think you're absolutely
And that's
right.
the goal that we need to be out there preaching about.
That's right. Marty, you've sort of seen this play out before in terms of, TANF and what it takes, even under Newt Gingrich, what it takes to have a reset, or folks realizing that, hey, what we've done in the past isn't going to be sustainable. We have to reset it at some point. Is this a time like the past, where we sort of, we're balancing our budgets, had a conservative approach to how we were spending, and can we pull back on those principles and do it again this time? Are we in a place culturally, or is there even a political will to get our money right and make sure that we're not spending ourselves into an insurmountable amount of deficit?
Well, I think there are a lot of people in Congress who have that will right now, and you have to educate the American people about what you're doing. A lot of this sounds very similar to what happened with the Republicans under Newt Gingrich when he was a speaker, and some similar arguments, really. And you mentioned the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program, with TANF being the acronym. That had been the Aid to Families with Dependent Children program, known as the welfare program, basically. And that was abolished. This federal entitlement program was abolished, and in its place was a block grant. And then the block grant went to the states. The states had a certain amount of money, and they had certain parameters on what they could spend it on, but they had a lot of freedom to how they design the programs and so on. And that worked a lot better. There were a lot of predictions before that. People were going to be out on the street. Poor people were going to die in the street. You had people resigning from the Clinton administration, high-level people and so on, in protest over that welfare reform bill being passed. But it led to more people working, more financial responsibility, better outcomes, and so on. And I think that that's what we have to do now. But we also had these discussions back then about Medicaid, Medicare, and can we at least slow the growth in these programs? No, they were going to increase, but the left is going to push back. And when you start with these higher baselines that we've had because of COVID and things like that, that makes it that much harder to get it back down. But I think we have to make the point that, yes, there were dramatic increases during COVID. We can't say this is the new normal, this is the new baseline. We have to have a more responsible baseline. But I think we have to have a situation where the states in particular have skin in the game.
I think you're right.
California manipulating their Medicaid system to have a shell game with the hospitals on how they claim money. There are people who have worked in the administration at Department of Health and Human Services and other places, become consultants to the states.
It's unbelievable.
This is how you maximize your reimbursement. This is how you basically can game the system to get the most money back. I think you have to take those incentives away, say, the states, you have a set amount of money based on population formulas or poverty formulas. Maybe different programs work differently with that kind of formula, but give them a limit on what they have to spend, and then force them to spend it wisely, not just keep coming to sugar daddy in Washington, D.C. saying, well, the more money we get from Washington, the better, then we can go back home and brag. We brought home the bacon, we brought home all this kind of money.
And
right?
ultimately the wheel keeps going, they keep their positions, and who faults for it or who gets the burden of it are the American taxpayer dollars that are seeing their dollar be less and less of value, inflation being increased. We have an opportunity, I guess, in reconciliation between April 7th being a big day where some of this language is going to come out, some of the numbers will come out, but probably up until September. So this next 6 or so month, I can't do math, three and a half month period, where we'll really be diving into the details of, can we do reconciliation? Can this budget reconciliation help Americans just in a little bit on a bunch of these issues that we're talking about? Work us through what to expect when it comes to what we're hearing. a certain amount of cuts, but a debt ceiling increase. How do we sort through the noise of budget reconciliation and find a through line that kind of brings the solutions that we've talked about today, but also, it helps the average American understand where they are in terms of what Congress is doing?
Yeah, first of all, just to put a exclamation point on what Marty was just saying, the federal taxpayers, the federal government, is going to give more money to California just for Medicaid this year than the entire state budget of the state of Florida.
Wow.
California is expecting $120 billion in federal Medicaid funding, and most of it is from scams, where they're not even putting up any of their own money. They're just doing exactly what he said. Here, we'll tax the hospital, get the federal funds, hand the money right back to the hospital. This is the scam they're running, and we're all paying for that. It's totally out of control. So I would love it if they could address that in this. I don't know if they'll have the will to do that.
I'll just say quickly, but interrupt you, to your point, you have the contrast on this side of the coast in Maryland, where Biden was saying, hey, we'll give you all this money. Maryland governor is saying, no, we'll pay 100% of it. And now Maryland's running a $3 to $5 billion deficit. A state can't run a deficit, right? A state has to balance its budget. So you have the contrasting principles. And ultimately what it comes down to is saying, hey, government's going to interject itself and provide in an area that otherwise the private sector should be doing, or just unleashing American prosperity so that we're not in a position where we're relying so much on government. But I interrupted what you were saying.
I think Medicaid needs to be focused on the truly needy, children, pregnant women, disabled people, and the elderly, and working age able-bodied adults. They need to be given strong incentives to get off of those rolls and all the other welfare programs and into work and on the ladder of economic opportunity. And I hope we'll see some of that in this reconciliation bill. There are already some indications that Senate Republicans want to retreat from doing anything on Medicaid, which was in the House budget. So that's going to be a big, big question mark over the next couple of weeks, is will they have the will to do anything about Medicaid, which is this huge out-of-control driver of spending. But a lot of the other spending things really can't be dealt with in reconciliation, because a lot of the spending problems are on the discretionary side, which is kind of a different track. The big, big question is, will they let the Trump tax cuts expire and have every family get hit by, a $3,000 average tax increase, have the child credit go from $2,000 a child to only $1,000 per child, have the standard deduction get cut in half, have the small business rate go from 29 to 40. So we're staring at a lot of really economically destructive tax hikes. And as much as we all want to see those deficits come down, the wrong way to do it is with huge tax hikes, because that'll undermine economic growth, and then you'll undermine revenue from all the other taxes, and we'll be in a much weaker economic position also, because all those people who lose their jobs will end up on government programs. So they've got to find a way to get all of those tax extensions into this to prevent tax hikes from hitting this economy right now. And the only way to responsibly do that is to have significant spending reductions. And so I really hope that we'll see both an extension of all those tax cuts, and they'll manage to get at least limits on the increase going forward of spending. And that's the big question mark. Remember, the Senate wanted to do a very small budget resolution that just increased spending for defense and border and didn't touch any of these bigger tax or spending issues. They've now come around.
They seem sort of convinced.
They've now come around with pressure from the White House that we're going to see some version of the big bill. So that's going to be the big question, is what stays in from the House version.
Okay, and we'll get to that right on the other end of this break. We'll talk a bit more about the tax stuff, but also pinpoint certain spending in our budget when it comes to the moral issue of abortion that we can target, being laser focused on removing big abortion providers from getting so much of our federal tax money. We'll address those issues on the other side of this break, so stick with us.
God birthed in my heart years ago to do this work of CURE, the Center for Urban Renewal and Education.
We are incredibly privileged to have pastors from across the nation here for training and collaboration on solutions to help our communities.
Freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. It must be fought for.
The Declaration meant what it said. All men are created equal.
We're to awaken, train, and mobilize the church as a whole, but the historically Black church in particular, to end abortion in our communities.
Every church needs to do everything it can to help be an educational hub.
The crisis of the day is the sexual gone wrong, and it's going extraordinarily wrong. Us Christians are called to correct that by living the sexuality that God has given us.
It was the church who created the idea of educating every boy and girl. The idea of public health care, guess where that came from? The church. And it was actually the church who was commissioned to do the work of charity. Guess who's actually robbed you of part of what it is that you're to do? It's government. And they failed miserably at it. They're not called to do it.
Government is not God.
Are we going to bow to government or are we going to bow to God?
The kids need to see that confidence that we have about the truth. We're not in doubt about who we are.
Well, welcome back to Cure America. I'm Jonathan Alexander, sitting in for President Donald Eason, who's the president now of Cure. We've been having a robust discussion once again about the culture, our finances, some in terms of our international posture in this world, and the ultimate prosperity that we're hoping returns to America. Part of that discussion includes cuts. How do we cut what we're spending? Cut what states are relying on for federal government input, but also cut some of these programs that are just on a consistent wheel where we're sending out money to organizations and entities that are against God's principle for life, that are against American culture. I'm narrowing in on Planned Parenthood and big abortion providers. Of course, God in His scripture talks about the preciousness of life from the moment of conception. He talks about the baby in the womb being special, unique, having an identity and a purpose. But we have in our country a framework that allows for the ending of that life within the womb to the numbers of over 21 million lives being lost in the African American community, close to 70 million, I think those numbers are right, 70 million since Roe v. Wade, in terms of lives lost all across this country because of the abortion industry. A big beneficiary of that is Planned Parenthood. They're the number one abortionists in this country, something like 1.1 million abortions, something like 3,000 a day, all at the foot of this mega corporation that is getting so much money from American tax dollars. Are we going to address Planned Parenthood and be able to slash the funding that Americans are giving to this organization here in this next year? There's a number of proposals, but talk us through why it's so important that we defund Planned Parenthood and other abortion providers here in this next year.
Well, I think it's so important because Planned Parenthood is the biggest abortion provider in our country. And we need to send the signal that, the president, Trump, was very clear during the last election that abortion, he said, was not a federal issue. Many pro-lifers disagree, but I say, okay, put your money where your mouth is. Defund abortion at the federal level. The federal government, if it doesn't belong there, it shouldn't be funding Planned Parenthood, shouldn't be funding abortions through Medicaid or anything else. And, Planned Parenthood, they just, I hate to say this, but they love abortion.
Yep, it's their bottom line. Yeah.
That is their bread and butter. That is their money maker. And they simply can't do it on our money. Yeah. It just can't happen.
Yeah, and everything they do sort of feeds this abortion machine. So they go and say, and even Trump was sort of susceptible to their talking points when he ran the first time, saying, well, they do other stuff like mammaries and breast cancer screening and stuff. But really all they're doing is bringing a young woman in, giving her all these tests to ultimately push her towards abortion. The manufacturing of the abortion pill and making that readily available, the curriculum that sort of hooks these children in schools onto a product of sexual promiscuity. They give them contraceptives that'll ultimately fail in birth control that don't work, just so they can reach their bottom line of the $800 a pop abortions that is fueling them. Then they go and receive a bunch of money, something like $699 million every year from American taxpayer dollars, and they're doing that to run campaigns against, good pro-life Republican congressmen and women, run campaigns to get some of these ballot initiatives that allow constitutional amendments to have abortion in states. They're such a bad actor, Marty. Run us through some of the political implications of how much Planned Parenthood spends on elections, how much they target good pro-lifers, and why they have such a huge cash cow from the federal government to push things that are really radical and immoral.
Well, they're very active at the local level. I remember working for a Republican congressman that got targeted by Planned Parenthood in this way, where they really mobilize their people and attack if they see you doing anything in the area of pro-life that is particularly going to affect their bottom line. You know, at CURE, we have done a report, several reports on the impact of abortion on the black community, and part of that relates to Planned Parenthood and their history of targeting the black community. And Margaret Sanger was the early president. She was a eugenicist.
Clear racist.
And it got to the point with they were so blatant about it that Planned Parenthood a few years ago had to admit that they had a racist history. People at the top level writing op-ed articles in the New York Times and putting out a statement signed by many former Planned Parenthood employees admitting their racist history. So that has been an underlying part of this over the years as well. But yeah, it's just because when there's a lot of money at stake, people will really fight. They're used to having this federal gravy train, particularly through the Medicaid program. That's their largest source, but the Title X family planning program has been a big one as well. So it's hard. You know, members of Congress need to stand up, but they need to point out that they are the largest abortion provider. The abortion people use a lot of euphemisms, and they focus on these other services. We've looked at some of the annual reports, and over the years, the prenatal care, for instance, with Planned Parenthood, that's been going down, but the abortion numbers have been going up. They've been pushing these mega abortion clinics, you know, and that's a big part of their business model now is these clinics, and that's a large part of their revenue stream.
Talk a bit, and thank you for that, Marty, for explaining the impact on the community that we're addressing, the African American community, and the cultural impact of what it means to suffer through 21 million abortions targeted to the community because of their racist founder, Margaret Sanger. But you also mentioned Medicaid reimbursements and sort of what we saw last week in Trump being able to claw back, I think, 20 million from the Title X funding. Bring us once again, Phil, to Reconciliation and Energy and Commerce, that committee where a lot of this money, I think all their money is funneled through. What should we look for in terms of the text that comes out of Energy and Commerce in the next few weeks that discusses defunding Planned Parenthood and other big abortion providers, and then bring us back to like 2017, 2019, where we did this before, and it showed that Planned Parenthood couldn't be dealt with in this way.
So the reconciliation rules are very complex, and nobody really fully understands what you are or not allowed to do. They basically go in and they have these very lawyerly arguments in front of the parliamentarian who then decides what can or can't be included. But this exercise has already been done on language blocking funding for Planned Parenthood and other large abortion providers, and it has been approved in the past by the parliamentarian. And so if they just run back the same language from those past bills, they should be able to include it in the reconciliation process, unless it is, it's complicated. Maybe there's some reason it's changed, but I would think that since the language has been included and vetted before, this can be done through that process, which means it can avoid a Democratic filibuster and be passed in the Senate with a simple majority. And I think the Democrats can really be exposed on this when they vote against it, because they've said a million times that they're pro-choice. It's not pro-choice to force people to fund something they disagree with. It's the opposite of that. And they also just look like they want to fund their own campaigns. The money routes back to them and benefits them politically. So I think it's definitely worth having a fight on it if they can get it in the bill. I'm sure some Democrat will try to put an amendment up to take it out, and that'll be an interesting vote also. But I believe that based on the recent experience that it can be done under that process.
Well, we're looking forward to it. Do we need to encourage our congressmen and women and the senators to stick to the fight? Many of our members can get squeamish when it comes to the difficult conversation there. Do we encourage them to stick to the fight? Is this something that we should be making sure is whipped all the way down from leadership? Is this the fight that
we have? I think that, look, you got a lot of Republicans now that have become skittish on the life issue because they see Soros and these other people come in and Planned Parenthood themselves with massive amounts of money and wall-to-wall ads, and we've seen that the last couple cycles. But I would just point out to them that it mostly hasn't worked.
Right, that's exactly right.
It mostly has failed where it's been done. And also, There's a big difference between where public opinion is on abortion itself and where it is on taxpayer funding,
the funding
of abortion, which is a winning issue.
I think it's a good point. Just to describe, and it's worth bringing our viewers behind the curtain of what Planned Parenthood is actually doing. Liberty Counsel has gone up against Planned Parenthood in court on several fronts, and there's a case coming up that's being brought out of South Carolina on whether or not you can defund, an individual state can defund Planned Parenthood. But Liberty Counsel has gone up against Planned Parenthood on a number of legal fronts, which allows for depositions, which is a on-the-record, you swear an oath to tell the truth. And there's a video camera, and you're asked some pointed questions about what occurs behind the curtain. And Planned Parenthood, in official legal documents, you can read it for yourself, talk about how they will breach a baby, which is not even a good way to give birth, but breach a baby in order to have the best, in their words, opportune way to procure the organs. And so they'll breach a baby, sort of force what is a partial birth abortion. They'll go in with a scalpel or pincers, cut off the legs, cut off the arms to preserve the sternum or this area of the child. Then they'll go in, cut it up, and remove organs, remove livers, remove hearts, ship them as quickly as possible so that in at least one instance, there's a beating heart, a heart that is still responding to its muscular contractions as it's going through the mailing system. And Planned Parenthood doctors, their abortionists are on the record saying, yeah, this is a process that we do in order to use not just abortion as our bottom line, but the sale of baby body parts as another income stream. On the record again, and it's worth going through the details, on the record there's a Dr. Nakatola talking about how she'll take a scalpel and go right down the face of a child. This is the face of a baby, large enough that you can recognize it, open up the child's face so that you can procure a brain. When Americans hear that, they have the reaction that we have here, they're aghast. They can't believe this is going on in my country. But to your point, Phil, it doubles down when you say your taxpayer funds are paying for this. So you're working, in a factory, or you're working on a roof. 4 of the 10 hours that you're working, you're giving to the federal government in terms of your taxes. They're then taking that pool of money and dispersing that, $699 million of which is going to Planned Parenthood to profit in this kind of activity. When that's put in front of the face of the American public, they're aghast and they say, I no longer want a part of this. So Chris, sort of give us the final word on this point. What needs to be done to communicate that hurt, that aghastness, that awful tragedy that continues in our country? What needs to be done to communicate that from the American people to their elected leaders and say that enough is enough with big abortion providers? We need to stop funneling their gravy train.
Well, this is an issue that's going to, I think, be determined by public response. And so all your viewers out there need to call their member of Congress and say, we need to defund Planned Parenthood. This money that's used for health screenings for women, all the non-abortion things, can be done by community health centers that don't perform abortions. Planned Parenthood, bread and butter, it is abortion, and they support abortion backing candidates, which is why no Democrats would ever be pro-life anymore, because of the vast amount of money. So we have to defund Planned Parenthood. We can fund all the non-abortion things other ways, but if people don't call in and say, no more, this is the bottom line, this has to be done this year, this is what we voted for, I'm worried that they won't have the backbone to do it.
Absolutely right. Well, you heard Chris's message. We'll be joined on the panel with Phil and Marty here right after the break, but take Chris's word. This is the time to do it. This is the opportunity that we've been given. It's a mandate, obviously, that's come through the election system in putting the right people in place, but we need to have the courage to push through and get this done here and this year. We'll be back right after these messages with one last panel as we sort of break down what to expect in this next year. We'll see you soon on the other end of these messages.
My name is William Owens, America's poet. During the elections of 2016, I wrote a poem every day and it's in my book, Poems for America. These poems speak to the issues of our nation like never before. Inspired by God, I know this book of poetry will be a blessing to you, your family, and your community. Visit my website, americaspoet.com.
Well, folks, I hope you're appraised now of the weight of responsibility that you and I have in terms of communicating our moral convictions for life to our elected officials as they're actually making the decision to claw back funding from big abortion, such a critical issue there. And I hope you heard Chris's admonishment to us that we have to keep up the courage and keep up the fight there. I want to pivot just quickly in this last segment to what we're seeing in terms of the executive orders and our election. So just this past week, March 25th, President Trump issued an executive order that talked about preserving and protecting the integrity of American elections. It's so important that this republic holds free and fair elections that Americans can trust. There's still a lot there that has to be done in terms of the meeting out and the processes behind an election so that we can verify its authenticity. Things that he signed into law, combating non-citizen voting, making sure that we have voting system standards, citizen verification, preventing foreign interference, that the states must cooperate in an overall election integrity system. We've heard election integrity for the past few years, at least the past 8 years. Are we getting closer to where we can certainly verify and trust our election outcomes, and what is coming out of the White House to ensure that, at least from the federal government, we're speaking to the election integrity issue? What can Americans expect in terms of an enforcement and good and safe elections here in the next few years, Phil?
Well, I think, as with so many of the executive orders, it's going to be a big question what the courts will allow the president to do without Congress. And, this has been an issue, particularly the non-citizen voting issue. This has been an issue that the House has repeatedly passed legislation on, but we've just never been able to overcome a Democratic filibuster. And so the states right now do not verify citizenship for voter registration, and therefore we've got a lot of non-citizens on the rolls. And in fact, we've got a lot of places now that affirmatively allow non-citizen voting in their non-federal elections. Wow. And so you've got situations where you've got notionally different rolls of voters for the federal and the non-federal elections, and are they really verifying that the non-citizens are only voting in the non-federal elections? Some of it's even crazier than you could imagine. Like here in Washington, D.C., the law is that anyone who says, I don't vote anywhere else, and I've been in D.C. for 30 days, they can vote, even if they're a foreign national who works at a foreign embassy, even if they're an illegal anyone. Yeah. You say, that's literally all you have to do. I've been here 30 days, and I don't vote anywhere else, and you're allowed to vote in D.C. elections for mayor or anything else in D.C. And there are other liberal cities that have done similar things. So we do need to make sure that only U.S. citizens are voting in federal elections. I hope that this executive order can accomplish that, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure that it can without legislation, and that'll be a question. And
much as you say, to the shock, I think, of many of our viewers, that you can just walk in and if you claim that within 30 days you've been there, you can vote. Much of that seems like it's accidental, but we know, Marty, that that's sort of intentional. That's why the Democrats bust in and flew in and allowed an open border for so many illegal migrants to come to this country. They were hedging on the bet that these folks were going to follow that pattern, go into vote, and they'd have a permanent Democrat majority in every state and certainly win the presidency. That didn't work out for them, but that sort of principle, or I don't say principle, their policy of mass importation of folks that they thought were aligning with them. Talk a bit about that and why an executive order like this can sort of start the standard in us saying that we have to have strong, responsible voting. We have to have it, at least in this election space, but we have to have it for the sanity of our streets. I'll just say one more line before you answer. In importing a ton of foreign nationals into this country, we got a lot of bad actors too. We got a lot of gang members, got a lot of drug dealers, and that has certainly polluted our streets. So talk about what's happening now in terms of election integrity, purging our voter rolls, but also the mass influx of immigrants and how that's impacted American culture and daily life.
Well, thanks, John. I think they are closely tied together. I share Phil's concern as well about whether or not this will withstand the scrutiny in the courts, and there is some federal legislation on the books, to Help America Vote Act, that may facilitate some of this. So this is what the House has been trying to do with the SAVE Act, to save the integrity of our elections. But when you have these situations like you're talking about with D.C., and you have this in some other states, how are they going to separate? When they're allowing these people to vote, you cannot have a non-citizen voting in a federal election. How are you separating these voter rolls? I think this is something that the Justice Department can actively challenge these states and saying, this is going on, show us how you're doing this, and enter into, similar to what they do with these consent decrees, right? Tell the states, if you want to get any federal funds, you need to clean up your voter rolls. You need to do this, 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 and this in your state to show us that you're protecting the integrity of your elections. That may be another way of going about that, or another way of enforcing these executive orders. What we had with Biden is they were not cooperating with states that wanted to find out what kind of illegal aliens are in our state, what people that should not be on the voter rolls, to match up those lists against the list of the voter rolls and see if there's overlap, and maybe there's 10,000, 20,000 or more people in some large states that are on these voter rolls. So that's something that the Justice Department under Trump can now do, is cooperate with the states, at least with the states that want to do that, and cooperate with the states and pressure them to clean up their voter rolls. What about dead people who are on the voter rolls?
In Pennsylvania, I saw a voter roll in front of me that had folks that were 150 years old still voting in the most recent election. And that's, there's not a person that old voting in an election, but that just shows a sort of, if it's mismanagement, that's one thing, but it's the intentionality of some of these states to do so. When you have a strong Justice Department that is there, that is helping states clean up, as you mentioned, states like Florida, Texas, and Georgia wanted the help of the Biden administration to make sure that you could have a clean and fair election, and they were sort of given the stiff arm. But we're seeing the tide turn in terms of a favorable Justice Department on this issue, certainly election integrity, but also on some of these deportations of the influx of migrants that came in. At the same time, you're seeing a bunch of states push back, sort of give the stiff arm against the Justice Department and ICE that want to carry out these deportations of some really nasty individuals that are in this country in terms of committing crime. So talk us a bit about the new Justice Department, sort of the challenges that they're facing, the progress that they're making in terms of deportations, but the challenges that they're facing even in these blue states that are rebuffing what the Justice Department is trying to do.
Well, first of all, I think we need to acknowledge that the border enforcement has been night and day. And so the influx has essentially stopped when the Trump administration came in, Tom Homan took over. And we had many months under Biden where we had 100,000 border encounters on the southwestern border sector. We had 8,000 in February. Okay, so we had, so it's night and day. It's night and day. They've essentially stopped the inflow. So that's step number one. And by the way, they did that without any new laws, which tells you that what happened under Biden was a choice. It was intentional to bring in that many millions of people. They could have stopped it had they wanted to. They could have done the same things that Trump has done. Now, the much more challenging problem, and it's one thing to be able to shut down the border, the bigger challenge is, how do you get rid of the millions and millions of illegals that were just let in by the previous administration? And that's where they've been active. But, on the pace that they're on now, they're not going to eliminate 10 million people who came in. They might get the worst violent criminals and that kind of thing. That's been their focus, which is sensible for the first steps. And that's right. But even that, they've run into massive opposition, as you correctly noted, and judges who've tried to block them, and states that have sued them, refused to cooperate. And I think that what we're going to see, and that what we are seeing from this Justice Department is, if you do not cooperate with these removal activities, you will lose federal funds, and substantial amounts of federal funds. And in the budget environment that most of these states and cities are in, that's a pretty credible threat.
That's a strong stick that they can use to do that. So the Justice Department being able to flex its muscles in a way that benefits the American public. There's one other area where the Justice Department and Attorney General Pam Bondi has been clear about, is going after violent crimes, particularly the violent crime that is targeting Tesla owners and the Tesla property. Talk us a bit about the violence that we're seeing against Tesla owners and Tesla property, and the sort of irony in why that's occurring. Justice Department is going to use the strong arm of the law to go after some of these perpetrators, but why are we seeing violence against Tesla owners and that property?
Well, it's because Elon Musk owns Tesla, and therefore they are very upset about what he's doing, his role in downsizing the federal government, and a lot of the money that some of these interest groups and these organizations have gotten. They see that threatened by him exposing some of the waste in there, but also finding ways that you can stop some of these money streams from going out. But it's just really outrageous that you have some members of Congress seeming to justify this type of activity. Now they've organized this Tesla Takedown Day and so on, where they're going to go out to every Tesla dealership in the country and will do protests and so on. But when you whip people up into this kind of frenzy, we're seeing the kind of violence. You know, we're seeing the violence of them burning, and a lot of times you see people making excuses for them, and then we should say, no, this kind of destruction is wrong. And we saw this with the riots in 2000. People were, if they were for social justice, it was okay to burn things down and destroy. No, you have to fight for social justice and any other cause through some proper means. And that's what we have to be very clear about. But this kind of violence should not be tolerated, and the people who do it should be pay a stiff price for it, including being deported when they're committing other kinds of crimes, not necessarily involving Teslas, but these other crimes as well. It's a privilege to be in America. That's right. If you're going to violate our laws, you're going to commit violent acts, you have to leave. No,
I think you're absolutely right. We're seeing that standard sort of meted out as well on these universities that took the October 7th Hamas attack on Israel as an impetus to go out and bully, harass, intimidate, and commit violence against Jewish students. You have many university presidents, college presidents that turned a blind eye to it in the name of free speech. Well, it's not free speech to be violent. It's not free speech to go after Tesla and its owners. And so certainly having a clear line being drawn between having consternation against something you disagree with, but going out there and promoting or even inciting violence. You're seeing a lot of that talk from top congressional Democrats. You saw the picture of them outside of the Department of Education demanding that they are let in. You heard, this talk from the Congresswoman in Texas saying that, hit him over the head, or, other ways of casting dispersions against their political enemies. It's risen to a level that is not unfamiliar. As you mentioned, 2020, we sort of saw that, but it's becoming more and more commonplace, and certainly an area that we need a strong Department of Justice, strong prosecutors that are armed with the power of the law to go out and get some of these violent offenders. We discussed, and I thank you, gentlemen, we discussed a lot today. We ran through the global positioning of the United States on the world stage. We spoke about the cultural implications of America being a leader in energy. Talked also about Planned Parenthood, that juggernaut that's operating domestically in the United States, responsible for the killing of millions and millions of lives. And finally, what violence and an open border and a lack of enforcement against crime ultimately does. And so these things are weighty. They're important because they affect every American life. And so we have to go through the motion of talking about it and putting policies in place to reverse some of these challenges. But they are weighty. And so I do want to end with just a verse that has been an encouragement to me. It comes out of Matthew 11, verse 28. Jesus says, "Come to me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am meek and lowly in heart, and you shall find rest for your souls." Christ anticipated a day like this in politics. He anticipated a day like this in our own hearts. If we're heavy laden and burdened with the weight of the world and the responsibility of raising a family in a culture that seems to be turning away from God, Christ says, no, come to me. Take my yoke upon you. My yoke fits you. I'll take your burdens. I'll deal with the tough stuff, but make sure you come to me in humility and forgiveness, realizing that Christ is always there to welcome those that are willing to submit to his will and his authority and the teaching that we have for our daily lives through Scripture. Thank you so much, folks, for joining us. Next week, we'll be back here right on this station with Cure America. I'm Jonathan Alexander.